What if Hannibal Lecter had raised Dexter and Brian Moser? As we've seen in the TV show Dexter, both boys lost their mother and father at a young age. In Original Sin, we even get a glimpse of Dexter and Brian moving into their new foster home alongside Harry Morgan. However, Brian struggles to fit in, becoming violent and attempting to kill Deborah Morgan, which leads to the eventual separation of the brothers. This creates the foundation for Brian's obsession with Dexter, eventually culminating in his attempt to get Dexter to kill Deborah at the end of season 1. But what if their story had unfolded differently? For those unfamiliar with Hannibal Lecter, he is a sophisticated, cannibalistic serial killer known for leaving no evidence behind and manipulating people into confronting their darkest urges during therapy. Now imagine if Dexter and Brian were both placed in therapy under Hannibal's guidance. How would they turn out? Would they become more sinister, or would Hannibal's influence make them better in some way? First, let's establish how Dexter and Brian would even end up in Hannibal's therapy in the first place, and why Hannibal would even want to take them on as patients. So Hannibal is known for taking a keen interest in individuals who are killers or have the potential to become killers. He can sense it. He can recognize the potential in someone like Dexter and Brian, both born into violence and trauma. Having witnessed their mother's brutal murder by a chainsaw, Hannibal would be fascinated by their backgrounds and would feel an intense, almost personal connection to them. After all, he himself was orphaned at a young age. Though he grew up in wealth, these similarities between his own past and theirs would draw him in. As we've seen with his past involvement with Abigail Hobbs, an orphan he became connected to in a twisted way, even though she was raised alongside Will Graham. Now, how would Dexter and Brian get into therapy in the first place, you may ask? When Harry Morgan first took them in Original Sin, Brian became violent, even trying to kill Deborah, as I already mentioned earlier. After this, they would likely seek professional help to figure out what was wrong with Brian, and Hannibal, specializing in psychological issues and trauma, would be called in to consult. This would be the setup for our storyline. With prior knowledge of the brothers' violent tendencies and tragic past, Brian's violent outbursts, and their shared experience of witnessing their own mother's deaths, Hannibal would feel a connection to them. He would see his own experience reflected in their trauma. As we know, Brian attempted to take on a quote-unquote father-like role for Dexter, trying to protect him after the death of their parents. Even though both boys were very young, Brian took the role of the older brother, much like Hannibal did for his younger sister, Misha, after their parents died. He would see in the brothers something that mirrors his own upbringing. He would become deeply invested in their development, seeing them as sort of a project, a reflection of himself at a much earlier age. And keep in mind, Hannibal would be conducting therapy while the brothers are still very young. And in Original Sin, during the flashbacks when they were both very young, Dexter is nonverbal and Brian speaks for him. So it would make this difficult to conduct a traditional therapy with Dexter. But if Brian is compliant and absorbs lessons, the information would likely be transferred to Dexter, since, they're both brothers and they share a close bond. Brian would want Dexter to be on the same level as him, which would make him a willing participant in therapy, even if Dexter himself is still a passive participant. Let me just get that out of the way. So unlike Hannibal's usual approach, where he conducts therapy with adults capable of or already having committed murder, pushing them to explore their darkest impulses for his own amusement, with Dexter and Brian, I feel like he would take a much more nurturing approach. But it wouldn't be nurturing in the traditional fatherly sense. Instead, he would nurture them in his own twisted, killer-centric way. He wouldn't teach them morality or restraint like Harry Morgan did with Dexter for the code. Instead, he would cultivate their skills for just plain old murder, teaching them how to avoid detection, manipulate others, and tap into their darkest urges. This would not be a lesson in control, but rather an exploration of their unfiltered desires. Hannibal would guide them, not toward becoming better people, but toward becoming more efficient and precise killers like himself. So in this alternate reality, Hannibal's influence would likely mold Dexter and Brian into far more sinister figures, kind of like Dexter in the books. So while Harry Morgan tried to teach Dexter to channel his urges for good, killing criminals, etc., Hannibal would encourage them to embrace their dark sides completely, pushing them to become even more skilled, ruthless, and methodical in their killing. So in my mind, I see the situation playing out in two different ways. The first is Hannibal teaching Dexter and Brian how to grow up to become serial killers like him, giving them all of his knowledge on how to evade capture and how to carry out their kills without leaving any trace whatsoever. So this path would be deeply rooted in Hannibal's mindset and philosophy. His teachings would go far beyond just physical technique. He would teach them how to manipulate people, to read their weaknesses, and how to understand how to blend in society while hiding their true nature. The psychological games Hannibal plays would likely be passed down to Dexter and Brian, making them not just skilled killers, but adept manipulators who could outsmart any investigator. However, Hannibal wouldn't give them all of his knowledge. If he were to do that, he would risk them surpassing him. And as a master, he can't afford to show all his cards, because doing so would just make him vulnerable. He has built his empire on being the expert. If you were to reveal everything, the apprentice might overtake the master. He would keep certain skills and secrets to himself, ensuring that he remains in control. The balance of power is crucial, and for those of you who have watched the TV show Hannibal, Hannibal loves to stay at least 2 steps ahead of his enemies and his allies. And as for the way of killing, unlike Harry's code, Hannibal would teach them that there are no rules, as I kind of already explained earlier. He wouldn't constrain them with a moral code of only killing criminals or targeting those who deserve it. Instead, he would encourage them to kill whoever they feel like. No limitations, no restrictions, no moral compass. The idea would be complete freedom, to be a free killer. The key would be in not getting caught, and Hannibal would make sure they understand every tactic to do so. He would even give them tools to cover their tracks, to hide in plain sight, and to understand the psychology of law enforcement to the point where they could predict what an investigator would do before they even act. And the second way this could play out is more aligned with Hannibal's need for control and maintaining the upper hand. So instead of seeing Dexter and Brian as future rivals, he might choose to use them as his protege, grooming them into becoming tools in his own plan. While he would still teach them on how to become killers, he would also be more selective on what they learn and how they grow. He would shape them in his image, but with a sense of direction. They would work with him, not against him. In this scenario, Hannibal might create a more refined approach, guiding them towards understanding the intricacies of the human mind and the psychological satisfaction that comes with murder. He might teach them to hunt together, creating a dynamic duo that follows the guidance and mimics his tactics. But under his control, this would form a sinister trio of sorts. Hannibal as the leader and Dexter and Brian as his loyal followers. Hannibal's influence over Dexter and Brian would make them more calculating and dangerous, but also loyal to him. This way, they wouldn't overthrow him, they would grow alongside him, operating as an efficient and unstoppable team. Their bond could develop into a version of a father-son relationship, where the love and admiration for each other are rooted in the shared desire for power, control, and the pleasure of killing. But ultimately, both paths could lead to Dexter and Brian becoming incredibly skilled and nearly invincible. But how they got there, whether it would be through rebellion and taking control, or loyal submission to Hannibal's teaching, would shape who they would become. Also, if Dexter and Brian were raised under the influence of Hannibal Lecter, one of the key differences in their lives would be the wealth that they would amount to. Because as we all know, Hannibal is not only a brilliant, sophisticated serial killer, but he is also a highly cultured and wealthy man. His wealth would provide Dexter and Brian with opportunities and luxuries far beyond what they would have experienced in their original life. In this scenario, Dexter and Brian would have access to private tutors and high-level education, giving them the tools not only to become deadly killers, but also sophisticated and intelligent individuals. The wealth and status would afford them a different kind of power, not just the power of physical violence, but the power of influence, manipulation, and prestige. They would move in the same circles as Hannibal, rubbing shoulders with powerful, wealthy people, learning how to use their charm and intelligence to manipulate situations to their advantage. All in all, with Hannibal's wealth and teachings, Dexter and Brian wouldn't just become your typical serial killer. They would be wealthy, influential, and unstoppable. They would have power in every form, in their physical and mental form. They would become, in my mind, the most untouchable serial killers in the world, operating from a place of privilege that would make them just even more dangerous.